watching the Catholic Family Podcast, Sundays with Father Denis. Straight talk and real Catholicism from Father Denis Chicoine, a true pioneer of the traditional Catholic movement.
Once in a while we listen to a talk show that we tape occasionally because of some of the stuff that is said, but I remember on one occasion not too long ago listening to someone who was complaining about the fact that the born-agains were trying to get the 7-Eleven stores to get rid of the Playboy magazine and these other magazines. And the author, or the man who was emceeing the show, said, "Gee, I don't know what we're coming to. This is ridiculous. I mean, it's a free country, and I can't imagine they're not allowing these people to have what they want to have." I mean, talk about demented and goofed up inside. And yet years ago, really not that long ago, people were embarrassed to be seen with this type of literature. Now you go on the airplane and the stewardess comes by and says, "You want a magazine? Playboy, Penthouse?" Right there on the airplane. People open it up and read it for everyone else to see. Again, this sense of sin, for the most part, unfortunately, with too many people, has all but disappeared. Remember we were saying last night about the fact that Blessed Peter Julian Emmard, in talking to his religious, was saying that even when they go out into the world to do legitimate work, that somehow they may find themselves covered with some of the dust of the world. And again, unfortunately, that's true for you and for me. We're in the world, not that we want to be part of it, we're in it. And we may be striving to not give in to those things that are not pleasing to God, but at the same time we're bombarded with all of this stuff all around us, and unless we're very careful, we can lose that sensitivity. Unless we're very careful, we can allow ourselves, on one hand, to complain about what's taking place, and on the other hand, even by degrees, to get sucked right into it ourselves. To the point that, you know it, where the only difference between some people who call themselves Catholics and others who aren't Catholic is that, again, they go to Mass when they can, or don't eat meat on Friday, but for the most part do the same things, maybe not to the same degree. You ever read what St. Louis Maire de Montfort says when he describes those who are going to persevere in the latter times? Tomorrow we're going to, again, review what St. Louis Maire de Montfort mentions in his book, True Devotion. But among other things in that particular book, he reminds us of the fact that as we get closer to the latter times, the persecutions will be on the increase. People will be experiencing heavier crosses, those that are trying to live their faith. And the world is going to be in such a state of chaos that in order to persevere, you're going to have to be a saint. As a matter of fact, you go so far as to say that the saints in the latter times will outshine the saints of the early times like giant cedars outshine little shrubs. Now, it would be presumptuous for us to say, well, we're those saints. The reason we're mentioning that is this. Things are going to be so bad, not only St. Louis Maire de Montfort says, it's prophesied by our divine Lord when he says, when the Son of Man comes a second time, will there be faith found anywhere on the face of the earth? For the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Our divine Lord mentions this fact. St. Paul talks about the great falling away, the great apostasy. And again, St. Louis Maire de Montfort mentions this to remind us of the fact, if we have any hopes of persevering as Catholics, we're going to have to strive to become holy. We're going to have to strive for sanctity. And again, sometimes we can have a weird conception in our minds as to what it means to be a saint. There are some saints who became saints by being in monasteries. There were others who became saints in the priestly vocation. There were some who were religious that were out in the active field. There were some that were hermits. There were some who became saints in the single lay state. There were some who became saints as married men and married women. So again, whatever category we find ourselves in, if we want to save our souls today especially, we're going to have to be strong enough spiritually not to allow the influences that surround us today to take us over. to the point that we, instead of living as Catholics, find ourselves living in the camp of the worldlings. And I know there's such a thing as prudence. I know that. But there's also such a thing as compromise. And we have to remember that also. I remember reading something, I can't remember what saint it was that said it, but I think it was St. John Maria Vianney. He said the floors of hell are lined with prudent people who use that as an excuse to compromise their holy Catholic faith. We don't have to go out and look for trouble in being prudent. But at the same time, I repeat, there could be a fine line between prudence and compromise. I'm sure that Noah, when he was building his ark, must have been the laughingstock of town. And can you imagine Noah saying, well, I better be prudent and not be, go out of my mind now in building this ark. Almighty God told him what to do. He knew what he was to do. He was obeying God. The society in which he lived had gone completely and totally mad. Otherwise, God would not have destroyed them. The only ones that persevered were those on the ark. Everyone else was destroyed. So what are we to do today? Again, I repeat, Vatican II did not come along, or the problems that stemmed out of Vatican II did not just happen in 1960. The problems were there before. Our Lady complained about those problems in 1917. She asked for an amendment of life in 1917. So are we going to go back to 1960? Are we going to be satisfied and say, what we should do now is be very careful? And again, I'm not attacking prudence, but I'm trying to get across a point. Suppose someone had the attitude, well, things are bad today. Let's go back to the way they were in 1960. Baloney. They were bad in 1917. And in 1960, it was worse than 1917. So again, when we talk about morality and the Christian way of life, there's enough in that you could give a retreat for a month and cover a different topic every day. But again, some of the things that we're familiar with, that we've gone over so many times, that we have to continue to review. And we'd like to cover these areas again, not simply saying something from us, but again, quoting what the Holy Fathers have said, and quoting what the bishops have said, and see whether or not we're living accordingly. Again, Father Thomas Marie put together quite a lengthy article, and we're going to have these things reprinted and passed out, having to do with morality in general. Now, what does that cover specifically? Areas such as TV, movies, bad companions, books, bars, motion pictures, entertainment in general, etc. And there's a vast amount of information that could be gone into every single area. But to some degree, let's just spend a little bit of time going into these areas. I'd like to begin by saying something or quoting something that Pope Pius XII had to say, making reference to books, just the things that I've read to you, the radio, movies, etc. It is superfluous to call to mind, this is Pope Pius XII, how much the radio and the cinema, not even talking about TV, how the radio and the cinema have been used and abused in the diffusion of this materialism. Likewise, obscene books, pornographic magazines, licentious shows, indecent dances, immodesties of the bathing beaches, all these have contributed to the frivolity, the worldliness, and the sensuality of youth. Coming from every direction, testimonies of many sorts agree in accusing these things as occasions of the religious and moral breakdown of youth. But a leading factor is the decline of family life, of which the moral decadence of the young is both an indication and a sad consequence. So Christian women and mothers, the Church gives you a special charge. Obviously that applies to the fathers also, but the children are more often with their mothers than they are with their fathers, and the influence that this has upon the children. If the parents don't correct the children and tell them what they should do, they're going to be influenced by the outside world. I remember, just to get across a point, I remember quite often we'd meet some young people who came from a strong family home, and these kids were so well instructed in their faith. Before we could really understand what was going on with Vatican II, You know, when it started to change and the catechism started to change and no one could quite put their finger on it. Here these kids were going in the classroom and literally having it out with their teachers and becoming the laughingstock of the class. But the point I'm trying to get across, these kids were instructed by their parents. And you have little kids in a classroom standing up to the teacher, teaching modernism and saying, "You're wrong." And when the teacher says, "How do you know I'm wrong?" "My mother told me. My father told me." In other words, these kids were raised in the faith at home, and even though they were in situations that were bad for them, they nevertheless were able to stand up for their faith. That wasn't something easy. And again, it's a tragedy that the young people had to be put in that position, but again, trying to get across a point. What happens in the home is so very critical and so very important. And you know, today there are many people who are not Catholic. They're actually putting forth heroic efforts in some of these areas to try to stem the tide of the filth and the smut. They don't even have the true faith, but they have the common sense to see and to recognize, to some degree, what in the world is taking place. That's a tragedy, isn't it? Those who have the faith, those who only have to look to the teachings of the church to know what's right and what's wrong, so many of them refuse to do so, and those that don't have the faith are in the process of battling, to some degree, the filth and the smut that surrounds us. We have here an encyclical letter written by Pope Pius XII in 1957. It's entitled "The Cinema, Sound Broadcasting, and Television." We've used it in the study program. I would encourage you to read it very, very carefully. Now, these are the words of the Holy Father in 1957. If he were alive today, he'd probably die quickly of a stroke if he ever turned on the TV set. And again, you have those who simply try to cut corners to such a degree that they always find a reason to make an excuse to justify their doing something that they know they shouldn't do. I remember one time when some boy came up to us and said, "Is it a sin to watch TV?" And he wanted a yes or no answer without any explanation. Now, the sin would be in watching something on TV that was evil. Or someone else says, "Is it a sin to watch a football game on TV?" Well, unless there was some immodesty, there wouldn't be a sin. And that's translated into, "Father said it's okay to watch TV." So again, the problem with the TV or the movies today is what's being portrayed on them. I don't know if any of you have ever done some research on subliminal advertising and using that same situation in all programs. We intend to try to find someone, we'll probably go out of our way to make sure he's not Catholic, to think that we're using that as an excuse, but to find someone who has a lot of information on the TV that will put together a nice talk or a video or something and show it to our people. Again, the minds that are being destroyed. Father Louis Marie was telling us, he gave a talk, he had done some research on this, and I don't know how many thousands, 40,000 or 80,000 murders that someone, an average child that watches TV, winds up seeing, to the point they get so numb and so dull to violence that they don't even react anymore to things like abortion. Anyway, I'd like to read in part something from this encyclical letter. And unless you've read this encyclical, you'll probably be quite shocked to see what the Pope has to say, even regarding radio, which compared to TV is almost nothing. He's talking about the movies now. Cinematography, first introduced some 60 years ago, must be reckoned among the greatest instruments for the spreading of modern ideas and discoveries. We have already had occasion to speak of its various achievements and its peculiar fascination. So he goes on and on to talk about what could take place insofar as TVs are concerned. He's talking to the bishops now. It must be your special concern, venerable brethren, to see that your respective national offices, subject as they must be to your authority, keep the various classes of interested citizens well informed about these entertainments. They must give advice, as we said, and from time to time, as occasion demands, issue directives with a view to furthering as far as possible the interests of this most noble cause which can do so much good for souls. This requires the prompt, regular, and frequent publication of classified lists of motion picture plays so as to make the information readily accessible to all. This should be done by a committee dependent upon your respective national offices. It should be composed of reliable men, outstanding for their doctrine and practical wisdom, since they will have to pass judgment on the various films in accordance with the requirements of Christian morality. You remember when they used to have these different groups, and a Catholic would pick up a newspaper and read the paper and say, these films are condemned and these are with reservation, etc., etc. You ever look at the newspaper now where they have the films advertised? It's an occasion of sin to look at the advertisements. For the most part, parental guidance or XX movies. So if someone is below 17 years old, they must be accompanied by their parent. In other words, the kid has to go with the parent to watch the garbage and to watch the filth. It doesn't make sense. And in an age where there should be something like this, which is put into effect by the Holy Father, there's nothing. They've just abolished these things now. And I wonder how many families take the chance over and over and over again, will go to the movies, oh, it was rotten. They go next week, oh, it was rotten. They keep going to these rotten movies. And in the process, especially if they take their children, you don't think that sinks into their minds and stays in their minds? It certainly does, especially the mind of a child. But the Holy Father, again, in talking about the movies, we must also utter a vigorous warning against the display of commercial posters which ensnare or give scandal, even when, as in sometimes the case, these advertise films which are morally irreproachable. Who can tell the great harm that is done to the minds, especially of the young, by posters of this sort, the numbers of impure thoughts and evil desires they occasion, the extent to which they may continue to the corruption of public morality, which in its turn is bound to have an adverse effect on the prosperous condition of the state itself. He goes on to speak about the radio. Now listen, this is the radio. The first duty of the listener to the radio is to make a careful and deliberate choice from among the programs offered. These must not be allowed to enter the home indiscriminately. They must be admitted as a friend is admitted on prudent and deliberate invitation. A person who makes no choice of the friends who will enter the sanctuary of his home is clearly at fault. The radio programs which are accorded the like privilege must be such as encourage truth and goodness, not those which draw members of the family away from the fulfillment of their duty, whether to individuals or to society, but rather those which give them strength and carry out their duties properly. For children and adolescents, programs must be chosen which are harmless and which assist and extend the salutary control of parents and teachers. So we tell our children, the students that go to school, you just can't have a radio and just turn on the radio anytime you want to and just do your own thing. Because again, on the radio today, on these stations where they have this acid rock or the country, western music, whatever, they're usually singing about blaspheming or making noise about someone who's sleeping with someone else's wife or husband or whatever. And then they have these kids, gee whiz, you can't do anything around here. Again, do they expect us to say, yes, you may listen to that filth, you may listen to that smut? And if that were the case, if these children go to hell, they will be cursing whoever allowed them to listen to that stuff. But again, there's such a situation today in the world that many people would think, and well-intentioned people, well, you know, I mean, crying out loud, the kids have to do something. Does that mean, again, that they have to be allowed to do that which is contrary to Catholic morality? It doesn't make sense. Listen to this. Parish priests should warn their flocks that they are forbidden by divine law to listen to sound broadcasts which are dangerous to their faith and morals. By divine law, forbidden by divine law. You want to listen to Billy Graham? You want to listen to the nice Protestant minister down the street who sounds more Catholic than the local Catholic priest? How many people who call themselves Catholics have been led astray by the likes of Billy Graham or the 700 Club or the conservative Protestants who may sound more Catholic than the local Catholic heretic who calls himself a priest? But at the same time, the Pope here says it's forbidden by divine law to listen to broadcasts which are dangerous to their faith and morals. And I repeat, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands, even more than that, maybe millions, of once Catholics who are no longer Catholic because of the fact they listened to sermons, to radio broadcasts, or they watched on TV these non-Catholic ministers that appear to be preaching morality, but in doing so were preaching anti-Catholicism. Now again, this is written in the 1950s. At the end of this particular encyclical letter, here's what the Holy Father says, and these words are directed to the priests. We cannot end this letter, venerable brethren, without reminding you of the tremendously important role of the priest. As in other spheres of the apostolate, so here too, he has a vital part to play in this indispensable work of the Church regarding the promotion and use of inventions for the spreading of ideas. He must have a thorough knowledge of all the problems to which the cinema, sound radio, and television give rise in the minds of Christians. As we said in our address to those who took part in the study week called to consider the effect of current conditions on the sacred ministry in Italy, the priest to whom is entrusted the care of souls can get to know, and must get to know, the bearing which the findings of modern science, the liberal arts, and technical progress have upon man's final purpose and his religious and moral life. He must learn to make a proper use of these modern aids when this is demanded of him by the nature of the ministry entrusted to him on the prudent judgment of ecclesiastical authority, or by the need for reaping a richer harvest for souls. In using these inventions for his own diversion, he must give to the laity a shining example of prudence, conscientiousness, and restraint. So again, a priest would be fulfilling his daily duty in warning the faithful in these particular areas. Again, it's not that the TV or the radio or the movie screen is evil in itself. As a matter of fact, in a great deal of the encyclical letter, the Pope goes on to talk about the beautiful benefits of the opportunities to spread the faith by using these means, and it was done. But look what has happened in recent years. We've made use of, and I know that you have here, have made use of copying programs with the VCR, or copying something and cutting things out in order to provide entertainment. And this is good. This is a way of using this modern invention for the greater glory and honor of God. But at the same time, again, in raising children, unless you have control of these media with your children, there's no way they're going to be unaffected. Again, I repeat, for the most part, it's filth. When you watch a sports thing, something on sports, the commercials are rotten. And it would be good for you to look into, to investigate, and to try to read some literature, really having nothing to do with religion per se, but to show you the damage that is done to the minds of people who simply plop themselves before the TV set and just make that a way of life, that watch TV all day long, a great part of the day. They're destroying themselves. The minds of the children are being destroyed. Whoever thought, as we said earlier, that in your own living room, a little child could go and turn on a TV set and view those things that people used to do in hiding and in secret years ago. And again, for some people, unfortunately, it's become almost a way of life.